When I first moved into my new house, I thought I had finally found peace. It was a quiet suburban neighborhood filled with families, children playing in the yards, and the occasional sound of someone mowing their lawn. But then there was Mr. Patterson, my next-door neighbor. From day one, he made it very clear that he thought the street belonged to him. It started small. He would accidentally park his car halfway into my driveway, blocking me from getting out easily. When I politely asked him to move it, he laughed and said, "You'll get used to it. Everyone around here does." That should have been my first red flag. Then came the complaints. He would knock on my door to tell me my lawn was too green, that I watered it at the wrong hours, and even once accused me of making too much noise when all I was doing was quietly grilling on my back porch. I tried to ignore him, but it got worse. One morning, I woke up to find that my garbage cans had been dragged to the end of the block. At first, I thought maybe it was kids playing a prank, but the next week, it happened again. This time, one of the cans was tipped over, and trash was spread all over the street. Guess who was standing on his porch with a smirk on his face? That's when I realized this wasn't random. This was him. He wanted me gone. I decided to keep quiet for now. Instead of confronting him, I bought a couple of security cameras and installed them, making sure they were hidden but angled perfectly toward my driveway and the side of my house. And sure enough, within a week, the cameras caught him, dragging my trash cans, spraying weed killer near my fence, and even tossing fast food wrappers into my yard when no one was looking. At that point, I knew I couldn't let this continue. I started documenting everything, every single incident, every video clip, every petty act of sabotage. But instead of going straight to the authorities, I decided to plan something far more satisfying. Now that I had footage of Mr. Patterson's little games, I felt both relieved and furious. Relieved because I finally had proof. Furious because this man had been tormenting me, for no reason other than his need to control everyone around him. Instead of striking back immediately, I decided patience would be my best weapon. Patterson loved to show off in the neighborhood. He was the kind of guy who bragged about his lawn being the cleanest and the most award-worthy. He even had a little sign he put up every summer that read, "Yard of the Month." No one had given it to him. He made it himself. That gave me an idea. I went online and started ordering supplies, bags of wildflower seeds, a few ground cover plants that spread fast, and something special. A type of grass seed that grows quickly and doesn't blend in with the typical lawn. My plan wasn't to destroy his yard outright. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I wanted slow chaos, the kind that eats away at him little by little. But I didn't stop there. Remember how he always parked halfway in my driveway? Well, I discovered that city ordinances in our area had very clear parking rules. I started taking photos of his car every single time he encroached even an inch past the property line. Then I made anonymous reports to the city's parking enforcement. The first time he got a ticket, he stormed over to my porch, waving the paper like it was my fault. "You think you're funny?" he shouted. I calmly shrugged and said, "Maybe you should read the street signs better." The look on his face was priceless, but that was only the beginning. Every time he messed with me, dragged my trash cans, threw garbage, sprayed near my fence, I made sure the consequences doubled. By now, I had hours of footage saved. I started to think about when and how I would unleash it all, but I knew the timing had to be perfect. Then came the breaking point. One evening I walked outside to find the broken slats in the side fence that separate our yards. Someone had pried a panel loose and shoved it back crooked, splinters everywhere. My heart sank. This felt different. This was no longer childish mischief. This was escalation. I picked up a splintered piece and noticed the faint smell of motor oil on it, the same scent I'd seen on his lawnmower the week before. Enough was enough. Instead of rushing to confront him, I did what I had learned to do. I cataloged everything. I fixed the fence myself, partly because it cost less, and partly because repairs would leave me more control over the timeline. While I was hammering the new slat in at midnight, I left one nail deliberately not driven all the way. A small, stupid detail to many, but to me it was a seed for what came next. Over the following days, Patterson grew bolder. He started delivering passive-aggressive flyers to the whole block about community standards, complete with a pointed line about caretaking responsibilities that anyone could read between the lines and know it was aimed at me. He'd stand by his mailbox when the paper boys came through, chuckling each time someone mentioned the flyer. The neighborhood began to whisper. Some felt sorry for me. A few rolled their eyes. A couple of older folks confessed quietly that they'd always thought Patterson was a little odd. No one wanted to get involved until he crossed the line with Mrs. Alvarez. Mrs. Alvarez was in her 70s and had lived on the corner 2 houses down for 30 years. She kept a garden that looked like it had been curated by a painter. Roses, marigolds, a small patch of tomatoes she fussed over like children. One morning, she found her tomato trellis sawed halfway through. Not vandalism for a laugh. It was a targeted attempt to ruin something she cared deeply about. When she came over to cry on my porch, her voice small and trembling, something in me hardened. This wasn't just about petty territory anymore. It was about decency. I started quietly recruiting allies, not with speeches or rallies, just small, discreet conversations as I took out the trash or checked the mail. The guy across the street who worked nights confessed Patterson had been a bully since he moved in. The woman with the 2 golden retrievers admitted Patterson had put antifreeze in her bird bath. She hadn't told anyone because she was afraid of retaliation. I didn't ask for anything big. I asked for small things. Keep your eyes open. Save receipts. Record the time of suspicious cars. The neighborhood became a low-key network of watchers. With evidence stacking up and allies on the periphery, I devised a plan that fit my rules. Stay legal, avoid direct violence, and hit him where his pride lived, his image. Patterson had one weakness, his reputation for having the best yard in the neighborhood. He polished that image the way other men polish trophies. So I set out to nudge his world into a slow, maddening wobble. First, the subtle sabotage. I accidentally left a handful of those wildflower seeds on the public strip near his sign. They took, and by midsummer, his immaculate green lawn sported bright, defiant patches of crimson and purple. He raged, of course, hired someone to lay fresh sod, and the next morning I left a carefully folded page of an old gardening magazine at his door, the headline underlined, "The Hidden Dangers of Monoculture Lawns." He called it a prank. He rounded on me at the mailbox, but this time I had witnesses who'd seen him trampling my flower bed a week prior. His fury was public now. Next came paperwork warfare. I had discovered in the neighborhood records a decades-old clause about fence heights and decorative installations. Nothing criminal, simply bureaucratic. I filed a complaint, anonymously, about his unauthorized flagpole and oversized statue, a ridiculous bronze rooster he'd installed last fall. The city inspector came, cited him for a minor violation, and put a temporary tag on the statue. Patterson waved it off, tore the tag down in front of the inspector, and left a tirade that the inspector later reported to me in stunned tones. Pride, I realized, was the one thing he could not bear to have questioned. But my favorite move, the one that felt almost petty enough to be art, involved the HOA newsletter. The HOA was a sleepy thing. Most folks didn't care. I found an old volunteer email list from 2 years prior in the community archive, and using nothing more than creativity and the patience of a snail, drafted a perfectly bland call for neighborhood submissions. I printed up a glossy mock newsletter, took it to the copy shop, and distributed it to the block. The top article, celebrating diversity in yard aesthetics. Second article, when pride becomes pretense, a gentle reminder. I used just enough ambiguity to make everyone squirm, and just enough flattery to make them read on. The effect was delicious. Conversation shifted. People stopped saying Patterson with annoyance and started being pointedly curious. Neighbors who had been silent now asked him politely about his statue, his frequent screaming matches with lawn care services, the friendly flyers he left. Each question was a mirror. He recoiled. He would smile too widely and over-explain. Pride, again, eroding. As summer deepened, my tactics escalated in a way that was still within the pale of civility. I organized, quietly, with 2 neighbors. a neighborhood yard showcase called Real Roots. It was a small block event that emphasized sustainable gardens and community shared spaces. I personally invited everyone but Patterson. Why invite him? Because I wanted the block to notice who was conspicuously absent. I assigned tasks, baked goods, a playlist, a best wildflower patch ribbon, all small, free, and cheerful. The day of the event, the front lawn we used filled with children, dogs, and a sprawl of folding chairs. Patterson drove by twice and did not stop. He honked once in a way that made him look petulant, then peeled away. That same evening, while the neighborhood basked in string lights and polite laughter, I replayed the security footage again. There it was, Patterson around midnight, moving along my side of the fence with a flashlight and a garbage bag. He'd returned to the scene of his earlier mischief. This time, though, something else happened. A car he didn't own pulled up silently behind him. A shadow got out. 2 figures. They spoke in hushed tones, but one of them gestured toward the crooked nail I'd left in the fence weeks earlier. When Patterson pushed at the panel, the loose nail gave way, and a small cascade of dirt and a few hidden seed packets tumbled onto his shoes. A tidy little trap that would mark him with my handiwork if anyone saw him in the morning. I slowed the clip, watched the seed packets scatter, the 2 men exchange a quick look, and then the homeless man, the one who sometimes slept behind the laundromat and who'd once offered me a sparely wrapped sandwich, slipped the seed packet into his own pocket. His eyes met mine through the camera, and for an instant there was a strange, private understanding. He wasn't working for me. He'd been fed off the same neighborhood scraps. But he had a practical streak and a survival ethic that appreciated a good, quiet plan. The next morning, Patterson stormed down the street with evidence of some minor vandalism. Seeds scattered, a smear of dirt on his shoes, the torn tag stub from his statue left on his porch. He rattled on to anyone who'd listened about being targeted by a smear campaign. A few neighbors did listen. Most had already chosen sides. But then, a twist. He went to the local police station and filed a report claiming trespass and theft. I sat on my couch and watched the world tilt toward a new danger, legal scrutiny. That's when I decided to prepare a different kind of armor. I called in favors for character statements from those neighbors who had seen his antics firsthand. I printed out my footage and made copies. I compiled dates, times, and small, mundane receipts that tied his actions to patterns he couldn't deny. I also wrote a careful, emotion-free letter to the police, explaining what I had and why I hadn't gone public sooner. The moment I finished and sealed the envelope, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. We need to talk. Tonight. 10:30. Third lamppost by the park. No name. A map pin. My skin prickled because this was the first time someone outside my cautious circle had sought me out in secret. At 10:30, under the yellow halo of the lamppost, I found 3 people waiting. The homeless man from the laundromat, Mrs. Alvarez wrapped in a cardigan and clutching a thermos, and the mailman who had been avoiding involvement until the tomatoes got cut. The homeless man spoke first, voice low. "You think you're the only one tired of him?" he asked. Mrs. Alvarez, who smelled faintly of roses and menthol, put a hand on my arm. "You never did tell us your name," she said, and smiled a small, conspiratorial smile. I realized then that my solo campaign had quietly become a shared effort. People who felt powerless had begun to reclaim power in small, ingenious ways. We weren't out for blood. We wanted normalcy. We wanted the freedom to leave milk on each other's stoops and not fear it being thrown into the road. We want our kids to play without a spectacle. We mapped a plan that night that relied on nothing illegal, petitions, small community events that shone a light on the things Patterson used to hide behind, documentation delivered to the right hands, and a slow social approach that would isolate him by exposing his ego. But the homeless man, who called himself Ellis, had one last, more personal idea he mentioned almost shyly. Sometimes a mirror does more damage than a hammer. He tapped his temple and we all laughed, but I could see he meant something subtler than a joke. 2 days later, I received an envelope slipped under my door. Inside, on crisp paper, was a photo of my driveway taken from a strange angle. The timestamp, 2 nights ago, 2:14 a.m. On the back, a single line. You're good. Keep going. No signature. No name. Patterson grew restless. He started following me to the mailbox, his questions sharp and public. He took to hosting loud barbecues where he made pointed jokes about neighbors who overreacted. Yet every time he roared, someone nearby would reply with a calm anecdote of something he'd done. A neighbor who'd had his sprinkler system tampered with, a teen who'd been chased off a yard for no reason, a woman who'd found her garden hose knotted that morning. The tide was turning without anyone having to shout. Then, one hot afternoon, the mailman, the one who'd been on the fence about getting involved, handed me a small, official-looking packet and said, "You're not going to like this, but it's from the city." Inside, a notice. A complaint had been filed about my own property, a nuisance complaint alleging unauthorized accumulation of debris. My jaw dropped. It was petty, mean, and perfectly timed. The packet included a photocopied citizen complaint form with handwriting scrawled across it. My hand shook when I saw the signature, Patterson's name, in his unmistakable, looping script. As I stared at the page, the familiar itch of war returned. He'd gone legal. He'd tried to flip the script, but he'd made a mistake. He'd signed his name. I put the packet with the others, and then did something I hadn't done before. I mailed a short email to the city's community liaison, attaching the footage and a timeline. I CC'd a couple of neighbors who were tired of the drama. I kept the tone neutral. The next day, the liaison replied, asking for a meeting. At that meeting, with an official from the city and a mediator present, Patterson arrived with his statue under one arm, as if to prove a point. He sat smug. He expected performance. He expected theatrics. Instead, the mediator asked for specifics. Calm, methodical, I played him the videos. I read dates and quotes. I handed over receipts. I watched his composure fray under the steady, bureaucratic light. And then, right when I thought the meeting might finally steer toward resolution, a new problem surfaced, an anonymous post on a neighborhood forum alleging something true but devastating, that I had once been evicted from a previous rental for disruptive behavior. The post included what looked like a scanned eviction notice and a handful of comments from people who sounded like strangers. The thread exploded overnight. A few neighbors who had been leaning my way started to retreat, hesitant now, unsure who to believe. I stared at the thread and felt every previous victory wobble. Someone was playing chess on multiple boards, and this time they'd flung a piece I hadn't seen coming. I checked the metadata on the images and then the messages, tracing what I could. The trail grew faint. The phone rang. It was Mrs. Alvarez, voice small. "I don't think he's done yet," she said. "He's getting dirtier." And that was true. The conflict had moved beyond petty pranks into a murkier realm where reputation and rumor carried weight. I had the footage, the witnesses, and the slow-building goodwill of most of the street. He had the willingness to lie. Both roads were dangerous in their own way. So I decided to change the cadence of my approach. No more one-off jabs. No more letting him bait me into public confrontations. Instead, I began constructing a narrative of my own. An archive. A gentle timeline of truths that included contributions from the people who had seen him at his worst. I asked a friend who'd worked in local journalism years ago to help me draft a clear, concise statement that I could release if the harassment escalated. I also asked Ellis to keep an eye on strange cars and to keep me posted if Patterson escalated. And then, late one night as summer leaned into fall, I found something else on my porch. A single hand-painted wooden birdhouse nailed into the post that supported my mailbox. It was badly painted, an amateur job with lopsided flowers. Tacked inside, a note. For the birds who sing too loud. There was no signature, but there was a smear of mud on the base, and the smear matched the dirt pattern on the shoes in the security footage from 2 weeks ago. I took the birdhouse down, opened the little door, and inside found a small folded map. The map had my street circled, and, in the margins, a messy little clue, where the rooster crows at midnight. That clue could mean anything, nothing at all, or everything. but it was a line cast out, a provocation meant to draw me into a hunt. I folded the map carefully, slid it into my pocket, and looked up at the rooster statue on Patterson's front lawn. In the kitchen window behind it, lights were on. Someone moved. A silhouette passed. The game was changing again. The stakes were higher, the players more hidden, and the neighborhood that had once been a background had become a chessboard. I had options: expose, confront, or escalate in ways that still stayed legal. I also had something else I hadn't expected: a small, ragtag alliance that believed in slow justice. As I stood there, the night humming with far-off crickets and the faint sound of a TV through open curtains, my phone buzzed with a new message. A photo this time, Patterson asleep in his chair, the bronze rooster visible behind him in the dim light. On top of the photo, someone had scrawled in red ink, "He always sleeps with one eye half open." I didn't know if it was a threat or an observation. I only knew one thing clearly. Patterson had started playing dirty enough that silence was no longer an option. I slipped the map and the photo into a folder labeled Timeline, Evidence, and I began drafting the next move. But that next move required patience, precise timing, and a touch of theatricality, the very things Patterson thought he owned. So I sat back, watched, and waited for him to make the next mistake. The night stretched on, full of small noises, and the house across the street glowed with the stubborn, smug light of a man who thought he could outwatch an entire block. And then, as if the universe enjoyed irony, the rooster started to sing at 2:02 a.m. Not from his statue, but from somewhere else entirely. A distant, irritated crowing that cut through the quiet like laughter. The sound of that rooster at 2 in the morning wasn't supposed to exist. Patterson didn't own a real rooster, only that ridiculous bronze one standing like a monument in his yard. But this was real, shrill, alive. It came from somewhere down the block, bouncing between houses, waking dogs, rattling the quiet. I slipped on a jacket and stepped outside. Porch lights flicked on up and down the street. Curtains twitched. A few neighbors cracked their doors open. And then, almost theatrically, Patterson stormed out of his front door in nothing but pajama pants, red-faced, waving a flashlight like a weapon. "Who the hell keeps a rooster?" he bellowed into the night. His voice echoed, ugly and jagged. No one answered, but I noticed something strange. The sound wasn't constant. It came in short bursts, always from a slightly different direction, like it was being moved around, too deliberate to be random. I stood still, listening carefully. Each crow had a faint metallic edge to it, like a recording played through a cheap speaker. Someone wasn't keeping a rooster. Someone was broadcasting one. My eyes scanned the neighborhood until they landed on a flicker of light across the street. Ellis, the homeless man, leaned casually against a lamppost, the faint glow of something in his hand. He caught my eye and gave the smallest nod, then tucked the object away. The crowing shifted again, this time from behind Patterson's backyard. Patterson went wild. He stomped through his grass, tripping over his own sprinkler head. He pointed the flashlight wildly at his neighbors' houses, shouting accusations. "I know it's you, Martin." "Alvarez, this isn't funny." "You think this is a game?" The more he ranted, the more blinds opened. The neighborhood watched him unravel, his perfect image crumbling one angry shout at a time. By the third crow, kids were laughing behind half-open windows. Someone clapped sarcastically. And then, as if planned, the recording stopped dead. Silence fell heavy. Patterson stood in the middle of his yard, chest heaving, hair sticking to his forehead with sweat. And in that silence, Mrs. Alvarez's voice rang out, soft but cutting. "Maybe it's just your statue finally learning to talk." A ripple of laughter spread. Patterson's face twisted. He stomped back inside, slamming the door so hard it rattled the glass. But the real intrigue wasn't the prank itself. It was Ellis. Because when I crossed the street later to ask him what exactly he'd done, he wasn't there. The lamppost was empty. No trace. Instead, taped to the pole at eye level, was a folded slip of paper with 4 words written in blocky handwriting: "Mirrors break in silence." The next morning, Patterson acted as if nothing had happened. He watered his lawn. He waved stiffly at passing cars. He even set up a folding chair on his porch like he was daring someone to laugh at him. But the neighborhood had already changed. Whispers spread faster than he could contain them. I knew now this was no longer just me versus Patterson. There were other hands in play, hidden players using the shadows as their battleground, and I couldn't yet tell if Ellis was my ally, or just someone who enjoyed watching chaos unfold. That night, another envelope slid under my door. This one contained a photo, not of Patterson, but of me, taken from behind as I stood. The photo of me on the porch sat on the kitchen table like a small, unpleasant present. My hands hovered over it longer than they should have. Whoever sent it had been close enough to get a clear shot. Not a grainy distance photo, but one that captured the way I hold my shoulders when I'm thinking. Intimacy felt weaponized. I decided to flip the fear into motion. I printed another copy, wrote on the back in big, neat letters, "We see you too." Then I slipped it under my own door and waited to see if anyone would follow the seed of the idea. If someone was watching my routine, maybe they were watching their own. During the day, life tried its usual tricks. Kids on bikes, a delivery driver who never learned to ring twice, Mrs. Alvarez watering her roses like a hymn. But tension hummed under everything. Patterson began showing signs of someone unmoored, small, frantic changes you notice only if you're paying attention. He started leaving his porch light on all night. He began driving his car in slow loops, as if searching for cameras. He talked louder, more often, as if oral punctuation could fill holes in confidence. I doubled down on evidence. The pile of timestamp clips grew until my phone memory moaned. I edited the clips into short, neat files labeled by date, then backed them up to a cloud folder with a password only a few trusted neighbors knew. Ellis had offered to hold physical copies in his worn backpack just in case, and I accepted. There was a practical nobility to his offer that made me like him more than I expected. One evening, when the sky turned the color of old bruises and the air smelled of rain, the neighborhood forum blew up again. Another anonymous post, another rumor, but this time it pointed in a different direction. Someone had found a small stack of flyers in the park denouncing Patterson for harsh treatment of community volunteers. The flyers' typeface was the same as the ones he'd been leaving. They looked like his work, but they were written in a tone that made him sound crueler, meaner, more paranoid than anyone had known. Neighbors were confused. Some assumed it was a classic Patterson ploy, manufacture anger, then play victim. Others thought maybe someone was trying to push him out by making him look worse than he was. The slicing effect of rumor made allies hesitate to speak up. Nobody wanted to stand beside a man who might later be exposed as worse than everyone suspected. That night, I walked the block, hands shoved in my pockets, and stopped outside the park. The lamplight made little moons on the wet benches. On the bulletin board, someone had pinned a hand-drawn map of the neighborhood with tiny X's and a single circled house. But the circled house wasn't mine. It wasn't Patterson's either. It was a modest duplex 3 streets over, where a young couple had recently opened a bakery and whose daughter sometimes biked past my house in a helmet too big for her head. The map had the words, "Not everything is what it seems." I felt the net tighten. In every direction, someone was pulling strings. Whoever had access to cameras, flyers, and photos had more reach than a single neighborly grudge. The idea settled like a stone in my gut. This fight had metastasized into something larger and messier. A week later, the city sent that quiet, bureaucratic letter every homeowner dreads. A notice of a scheduled hearing about a complaint against my property, date and time stamped, a small community room at the municipal building. The letter was courteous and bland on the surface, but the line that made my stomach clench read, "Citizen complaint alleging repeated nuisance behaviors." I showed the letter to Mrs. Alvarez at the bus stop. She paled and then gave a small, sharp laugh that wasn't funny. "They'll want paperwork," she said. "Make sure you bring everything." Her eyes flicked to mine like a lighthouse checking that the other boat had seen the warning. For the next few days, my life reduced itself to preparation. I made copies of every clip, every note, every neighbor's short statement. I rehearsed calm explanations. I mapped out the chronology in my head and on paper, neat columns, dates, times, witnesses. In the corner of the document I kept, almost as an afterthought, I wrote, "Potential risks, unknown actors." The unknown felt like the worst risk of all. On the morning of the hearing, a thin rain trickled down the courthouse windows. I arrived early and discovered I wasn't the only one there with a stack of printed papers. Patterson sat 2 seats down from me, his bronze rooster tucked under his arm like a talisman. He looked smaller without his front porch lights and the cushion of an audience. He smiled at me in a way that suggested victory or bluffing it. I tried not to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. When the clerk called the case, the room filled with a brittle quiet. The woman at the desk read the complaint. Generic phrasing, small black. Type. Then they asked us to speak. I played my role, factual, succinct, no invective. I presented clips on my phone, then passed copies to the clerk. Many of the neighbors who had rallied in small ways showed up, some not to testify, but to sit in the back like a forest of quiet witnesses. Patterson stood when it was his turn and launched into a practice spiel about victimhood and harassment, about how he'd been tormented and how his life was being made miserable by a coordinated campaign. His voice rose and rose until it sounded like the same old record. But then, and this was the moment everyone remembers much later, a new voice cut in. It wasn't Ellis's voice. It was the mailman's. He stood up, palms open, and said plainly that he had personally witnessed Mr. Patterson moving through other people's yards at night, and that he'd seen the trash cans dragged on 3 separate occasions. He mentioned the tomato trellis and a time he'd found Patterson arguing harshly with a teenager for stepping on pavement. He gave his name, his address, and left no room for theatrics. When the clerk asked if anyone else wished to speak, more hands went up. People who had been silent on porches now gave small, direct accounts. The clerk listened, her brow folding. The official turned to Patterson and, with the kind of tone bureaucracy uses when it wants to be decisive without seeming dramatic, scheduled an inspection and referred the matter to community mediation. It wasn't a legal conviction, not by a long shot, but it was the first time an external authority had taken the chorus of small complaints seriously. We left the building feeling lighter, but the lightness was fragile. Outside, my phone buzzed. A new private message. They're watching the bakery. Don't trust the map, no name. The bakery's daughter biked past my house later that day, and I watched her small body weave in and out of puddles, the helmet bobbing like a buoy. Who had flagged the bakery? Why? Back home, I found another package at my doorstep, a small tin with 2 keys inside and a note. Spare keys. For when doors get stuck, the handwriting was different from the rooster notes. This felt like a practical gift, not a taunt. But gifts in a theater of conflict are another kind of code. The keys meant someone wanted access. They meant either help or surveillance. I tucked them into my wallet and called no one. Days slid into each other. Patterson became more unpredictable. He started placing motion-activated lights along the edge of his property in a scattershot attempt at containment. He hired a security company whose van idled down the road like a big, uncomfortable animal. He installed an old baby monitor and pointed it toward my fence, broadcasting at a frequency that sometimes made my neighbor's radio pop. In response, I bought a pair of cheap signal scramblers and left them in a drawer for the day Ellis said he'd need them. Then a new kind of scandal erupted, a local gossip blog, the kind that thrives on salon-level intrigue, published an expose with the headline, "Neighborhood Feud Turns Ugly, Allegations Fly." The article compiled quotes from the forum, screenshots, and an unattributed rumor about a past eviction that the anonymous post had mentioned. It quoted Patterson's side with breathless sympathy and framed me as the antagonist. Traffic to the thread spiked. A handful of commenters dug through public records and posted contradictory documents that only added noise. I felt the sting of public narrative again, facts mashed into story, truth bending under the weight of drama. The blog became a splinter lodged under skin. People who were undecided drifted away under the pressure of messy headlines. When your life becomes a plot line, nuance evaporates. One evening, a soft knock at my door startled me. I opened it to find the bakery owner's wife, who I only knew by the smell of cinnamon whenever she passed. Her eyes were red-rimmed. She handed me a folded slip of paper and then, without a word, turned and walked away. The paper contained one line and an address, followed by a time, tonight, midnight. The alley behind the bakery. I felt a cold, electric tingle run down my spine. An invitation or a trap. Sometimes the difference is only a matter of trust. I thought of Ellis, of Mrs. Alvarez, of the mailman with steady eyes. I thought of the keys in my wallet. At midnight, under a sky so clear the stars seemed to clutch at the edges of the roofs, I walked to the alley behind the bakery. The air smelled of baking yeast and distant gasoline. The alley was narrow and smelled of recycling and rain. A lone street lamp threw gold on a puddle like a coin. I was not alone.